Rico to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I know this amendment has gotten a lot of attention over the last few days. This amendment would send this private school voucher bill to the voters of Texas for their approval before it can be implemented. This idea to send the issue of vouchers to the voters originally came from Governor Rick Perry last year. And then a few weeks ago, a group of conservative grassroots activists came up with the idea of an amendment that would do exactly that. They call themselves MAGA moms. These are not activists I typically work with, but this issue of private school vouchers brings people together across the political spectrum. A few days ago, there was growing bipartisan support in this chamber for this common sense idea. But then the governor of our state started calling members into his office one by one and threatening to veto all the bills of any member who votes for this amendment, threatened to make their primary elections, quote, a bloodbath. So this morning, I decided to carry this amendment. Not only because it's a good idea, not only because it's what our constituents want, but also to make a very important point. No one, including the governor, should ever threaten a lawmaker. We do not serve the governor. We serve our constituents. The governor is saying that putting vouchers to the voters is unconstitutional. That's not true. The way I know it's not true is because, as Attorney General, Greg Abbott wrote about statewide referenda and never raised constitutional concerns. The governor is saying there is no historical precedent for sending vouchers to the voters. That's also not true. There were statewide referenda in 1986, 1989, and 2006 on controversial topics. Lastly, the governor is saying Texans have already voted on vouchers. That's also not true. One, because there are a lot more people in this state than Republican primary voters, and this voucher will affect all of us in ways both big and small. Second, I think we all know that the primaries last year were not fought on vouchers. None of the TV ads, none of the mailers that the governor funded against our colleagues were about vouchers. And so I'm a little confused because the governor has said private school vouchers are wildly popular. And so if he's telling the truth, I would think this referendum would have no trouble passing. I would also think the governor would welcome an opportunity to finally have a mandate on this controversial topic. Texans have been fighting about vouchers for 70 years. The first voucher bill was proposed in this Capitol in 1957, and we've been fighting about it ever since. So if any issue should go to the voters, it's this one. We're sending a lot less to the voters for their approval this session alone. And believe me, this body has been very clear that any time taxes may go up, the taxpayers should have a say. And by creating a new parallel education system that will cost billions of dollars every biennium, this voucher bill will absolutely raise property taxes. And so I think the taxpayers should have a say before it's implemented. Members, regardless of where you are on this bill, you know that I'm passionately against vouchers. That's no secret. There are friends of mine in this chamber who are passionately for vouchers, and that's fine. That's what this body is all about. But let me just make a pitch on why we should all support letting the voters get their say. It's the only thing that'll put this issue to bed. Because believe me, even if this passes, we'll be back here next session and the session after that and the session after that fighting about vouchers, fighting about loosening regulations, fighting about expanding funding, fighting about changing eligibility. This fight will never end. The only way for it to end is for Texans to get their say on this issue. I know that you're under a lot of pressure from the governor. I know that. I get that. I know that's not easy. But last time I checked, this legislature was a separate and equal branch of our state government. The last time I checked, we still had separation of powers in this state. The last time I checked, this was still the people's house, not the governor's house. All of that is at risk with this vote on this amendment. So regardless of where you are on this bill, I'm asking you to stand with me on this amendment. Let Texans approve this measure. Let Texans get a say. I urge you to vote for this amendment for our constituents, for our Constitution, and for this House.
Ms. Goodwin, for what purpose?
Will the representative yield for questions?
Does the gentleman yield for questions?
Yes, I yield.
The gentleman yields for questions.
So I believe you said this, but I heard several members the other day say that we have already voted on this issue. Have we voted on vouchers? Have we let the people of Texas vote on vouchers?
No, Representative Goodwin. We have had primary elections where members were targeted because of their vote on vouchers in the past, but as a proposition, as a referendum, vouchers has never been put to the voters.
And these members even suggested that in the general election we voted on vouchers. Did we vote on vouchers in the general election?
No, Representative Goodwin, this issue has never been put to the voters as a proposition or a referendum.
And when was the general election?
November of last year.
Do voters sometimes change their minds over time?
Sure, but
When new information becomes available?
Sure, but again, this issue has not been put to the general electorate, and that's why I think this amendment makes a lot of sense.
Have you noticed that since between last session and this session, we have vouchers has been a very big issue both times. Last session, we had our regular session and 4 special sessions, and now here we are again debating vouchers. But have you noticed a difference in the response from people around the state?
You know, I've certainly seen Texans in both political parties in all regions of the state express deep concerns about this bill, who it will benefit, and who it will hurt.
It seems to me.
Again, Representative Goodwin, I don't want to make this about the bill. I have my opinions on the bill. You'll hear my opinions throughout the debate today. I'm sure you've already heard my opinions in committee. That's no secret. The thing I'm asking us to do here is let Texans express their opinions in a formal, fair election where we can finally put this issue to bed one way or the other. Because if the voters approve it, then there is a clear mandate from the people of this state for private school vouchers, and then there's not really any room to try to fight against it in future sessions. Or if they reject it, there's not much room to try to expand this program or implement a program like it in the future. And so, at least, I don't know where other members are, I would like this issue to be behind us. I think the only way to get it behind us for good is by letting our constituents have the final word.
I agree with you. I think letting the people of Texas have their voice heard through an election on whether or not we should implement vouchers in the state makes sense. And I'm really curious what the harm is. Why are we finding objection to this?
You know, I don't want to question anyone's motives, but I will say that there's already going to be the bill. If you read the amendment, the election would be during the constitutional election later this year in November of 2025. That election is already scheduled. There's already going to be issues on the ballot. Again, this would not be one of those constitutional amendments. It would be a referendum on that same ballot, very similar to what they did in 1986, 1989, and 2006.
I've expressed to constituents in my district that I think it would be great to put this up to a vote, and I've had an immense response to that. Have you found the same thing?
I have, and you know what's interesting is that even the folks in my community who are passionately for private school vouchers also want it to be put to a vote. And so again, I hope this is something we can all agree.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Little, for what purpose?
motion to extend time.
Motion's been made. Any objection? Chair hears none, so ordered. Mr. Little, for what purpose?
Does the gentleman yield for questions?
Gentleman yield for questions.
Yes, I yield.
Gentleman yields for questions.
Representative Tallarico, I'm extremely concerned by your allegations of the governor's threats against members. Which members did he threaten? Which of my colleagues did he threaten?
I don't have permission from those colleagues to divulge their names.
It certainly wasn't me. I don't think the governor even has my phone number. I'm a lowly freshman.
Sure.
But surely you do know who the governor has threatened, right?
I certainly know members that he has threatened, yes.
Republican members, right?
Yes, sir.
And your contention is that their votes on the board later today will be based upon the threats of the governor, correct?
No, sir. I certainly hope that members of this body will vote their districts and vote their conscience. And to be honest with you, Representative Little, my experience in this chamber, even as a Democrat, I'm in the minority, certainly don't agree on every issue. I've found that even the members that I disagree with the most have a lot of integrity. It's why I enjoy working in this chamber. And I've known this House to be independent. I've known this House to be courageous. And that gives me a lot of faith in this process, even when things don't go my way on the floor, which is most of the time, as you can imagine.
I share your faith in this process and the faith in the members here. And I believe that, and I think you'll agree that the lights that are going to go up on the board here later today, they are the product of sincere disagreement about this topic and not the threats of the governor. Wouldn't you agree?
I certainly hope that's true, yes.
And you believe in the Texas Constitution, yes?
Yes, sir.
In fact, you, right alongside me, I think your desk is back there, you took an oath in this very room to uphold that Constitution, correct?
Yes, sir.
So Article 3 of the Texas Constitution vests the legislature with power in this state and in this chamber and in the Senate to make laws, does it not?
Yes, sir.
In Article 3 of the Texas Constitution provides that no law, none, zero, no laws shall be passed except by bill, doesn't it?
Yes, I'm amending the bill. Yes, sir.
And Article 3 provides that bills may originate in either house and when passed may be amended, offered, or rejected by the other, right?
Yes, sir.
So the House can reject it or the Senate can reject it,
That's right.
not the voters in this state, correct?
Well, no, that's incorrect because these bills can be amended to require voter approval. I mentioned in my layout the times in our state's history that we've done this. One in the 1980s was Governor Mark White was trying to make the State Board of Education appointed by the governor rather than elected by the people. And so they passed a bill, but they said the voters are going to have to sign off on this before it happens. So it went to the voters. The voters rejected it, and that's why Texans still elect their State Board of Education members. But then there was also the example of horse racing, and again, this was before I was born, so I don't know the exact details of the horse racing issue. But that issue was put to the voters, and the voters approved it, and so then it became law. So it goes both ways, whether voters reject it or approve it. But as long as it's done by the legislature, Representative Little, I will certainly grant there is no citizen-led referendum in Texas. That's not allowed, as we all know. But the legislature can authorize a statewide referendum.
And Representative Tallarico, my understanding is this program is a $1 billion program, correct?
This voucher program?
Yes.
In the first biennium, yes. The fiscal note says it's going to grow to $7 billion in the second biennium.
Why did we not seek a statewide referendum on the over $8 billion educational funding bill we just passed? Why weren't you up there offering to amend that?
Well,
and send that to the voters?
I would certainly be open to sending as many big investments to the voters as possible. The thing I would say is particularly special about this issue is how controversial it is and how controversial it has been throughout our state's history. There's not a lot of debate for and against paying teachers. As you saw with the board on this issue, there was unanimous or near unanimous consent from this body to fund our public schools, even though I don't think it's quite enough. I do think this issue is different. As you know, there is bipartisan opposition to vouchers. It failed to pass in the last legislative session because of bipartisan opposition. And then I would add one more thing, which is the influence of big money on this topic in particular. As you know, Jeff Yass an
I
out-of-state
believe this is
billionaire,
personalities, is it not?
gave $12 million to Greg Abbott.
Members, you shall confine your remarks to the topic at hand and not bring personalities into this matter.
If we're going to delegate, Representative Tallarico, if we're going to delegate our lawmaking authority directly to the people, why do we need to be here at all? Why don't we just do that with every bill? Is there a good reason to do that?
I would say, and this is just my opinion as a member of the body, is that when an issue is going to have such an impact, such a historic impact on such a critical service like public education, when an issue may raise, and I think will raise, people's property taxes across the state, then that issue, especially when there is bipartisan opposition, especially when there is historical controversy about the issue, to me, and again, Representative Little, this is not up to me, this is up to our body, but I think this body is justified in sending this issue to the voters for their approval because of its impact on public education, because of its impact on taxes. And I agree with the members of this body in past sessions that taxpayers should have the final say before their taxes go up. And I think that applies to this bill more so than many others.
But how does this body decide which bills rise to the question of needing to go to the voters and which bills are important for us to vote upon? For example, we just passed a bill related to education that's over 8 times the size of this one, and there was no animus in this body to send it by referendum to the voters. So how do you suggest that we decide which controversial issues that may or may not have bipartisan opposition that we send to the voters?
So I'll give 2 thoughts. One is, how do we decide? The people in this body decide with those lights up on the board. That's how we make big decisions. That's how we make big decisions on a whole host of topics. Second, I just outlined in my own personal opinion how I would consider sending certain issues to the voters. And I think depending on the scope, depending on the impact on services and taxes, and depending on the level of controversy and opposition, to me, as a lawmaker, as an individual lawmaker, those would play heavily into my decision on whether something should get voter approval.
So Representative Tallarico, if I'm hearing what you're saying correctly, it sounds like we as a body should decide this issue is simply too important for us to consider in the Texas House of Representatives, and it must be considered by the people.
Well,
and then we just vote and decide, yes, we all agree this issue is too important for us to consider, and the voters must vote on it on the ballot.
One thing I would clarify, Representative Little, is that by passing the bill, let's assume we put on this amendment that would require voter approval before implementation, then I would assume the bill would pass with that amendment on it. And so we as a legislature, it's not that we're abdicating our responsibility, we are designating this issue in particular for voters to decide. So just by sending it to the voters, we are already designating this as an issue of importance. We're not just saying we're gonna vacate our jobs and we're just going to send every single item that comes before the legislature to the voters. That's not what I'm advocating for. What I'm advocating for is if we as a body deem that an issue is of such historical importance and will have such an impact on a key service like education and on taxes, that issue rises to the level that we should seek voter approval.
Why is it historically important?
Representative Little, I'll just add that this is not up to me. The only way we will get voter approval on this issue is if this body decides to do so. And that is true on any item that we take up. And so I'm just coming as one legislator, and I'm saying that I believe that this issue rises to the level that we should get voter approval. And again, there is historical precedent. I would, when looking at those historical examples, the reason that those were sent to the voters is because they were particularly controversial, because the body was unclear on its stance on that issue. And so those issues were put to the voters, others were not. And all I'm doing is proposing that the issue of vouchers, because of its historical controversy, because of its bipartisan opposition, and because of the impact it will make on Texans, I think, as an individual legislator, that this issue rises to the level of seeking voter approval. And Representative Little, if you disagree, and I respect your opinion if you disagree, I would encourage you to vote no on the amendment.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Little, for what purpose?
never mind. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Dr. Buckley in opposition to the amendment.
Mr. Speaker, members, respectfully, I move to table.
Fuck you guys. Get to him. Mr. Tallarico to close.
Okay.
Mr. Tallarico to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. I think if any issue should go to the voters, it should be this one. Again, I also think this amendment is particularly important because of the pressure and the threats made by the executive branch. Chairman Buckley is a friend of mine, but I think that the motion to table, rather than allowing this to be will of the House, is an example of that influence from the executive branch. And as a member, I resent that. I ask you to stand up for your constituents.
Ms. Weiner, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for some
The gentleman
questions?
yield for some questions.
Yes, I yield.
Gentleman yields for questions.
Thank you. Representative Tallarico, you and I have had multiple conversations about the potential constitutionality of this language, correct?
Yes, I believe strongly in the Constitution and would never want to bring an amendment to the floor that
Yeah.
would threaten or violate that Constitution.
So you and I both believe strongly this amendment is consistent with the Texas Constitution based on history and based on our reading of the text.
Yes, Legislative Budget Board, Legislative Reference Library have also confirmed.
Okay. And so, Representative Tallarico, Section 9 of the bill. I'm sorry, y'all, I can't hear. Section 9 of the bill has a severability clause, correct?
Of the amendment,
No, I'm sorry, of the bill. So Section
oh.
9 of the bill, as I understand it, says that if this legislation is challenged in court, that the different sections of the bill are severable from each other.
yes.
And so that means, my understanding, tell me if you agree, is that if you and I were wrong, which we don't think we are, but if we were wrong and this language was not constitutional, this language would not endanger the underlying legislation from going into effect. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yes, that is correct.
So members, regardless of the potential constitutionality, which we believe it's constitutional, would not endanger this underlying bill by supporting your referendum. Is that correct?
Yes, this is a constitutional, this amendment is constitutional. This amendment has historical precedent, but if for some reason it was still challenged in court and it was somehow deemed unconstitutional, it would not threaten the bill itself.
Okay. Thank you so much for offering this, Representative Tallarico.
Thank you, Representative. I move adoption.
Mr. Tallarico sends up an amendment. Mr. Buckley has moved to table the amendment. The question occurs on the amendment to table. A record vote has been requested. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Representative Leach voting aye, Mr. Buckley voting aye, Mr. Hunter voting aye, Mr. Harris voting aye. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? There being 86 ayes and 62 nays, the motion to table prevails.